We should probably just stay friends. Ashley said it the way someone might comment on the weather. Calm, casual, almost bored. We were sitting in a small cafe in Denver, the kind with exposed brick walls and mismatched wooden tables that looked intentionally imperfect. Outside, the late afternoon sky was gray, and a thin drizzle painted the windows with slow-moving lines of water. The place smelled like roasted coffee beans and fresh pastries. Quiet indie music hummed in the background. Ashley was stirring her iced latte slowly with a thin plastic straw, watching the ice spin lazily in the glass. She didn't look nervous. She looked prepared, like she had already played this moment out in her head several times and knew exactly how it was supposed to go. Most guys would recognize that line immediately. We should just stay friends. It's not really a suggestion. It's a conclusion someone already reached. And usually, the moment it's said, the guy across the table does what she expects. He asks questions. He tries to negotiate. He explains why things can still work. He promises to change things she didn't even clearly explain. But none of that happened. I simply leaned back slightly in my chair, nodded once and said, "Sounds good." Ashley's straw stopped moving. The ice in her glass slowly settled. For the first time since she spoke, she looked up at me directly. Her expression wasn't relief. It was confusion. "Wait," she said slowly. "That's it." I shrugged lightly. "You said we should stay friends," I replied. "If that's what you want." The silence that followed stretched longer than she expected. You could see it in the way her eyebrows pulled together slightly. Ashley had come prepared for a conversation, not an agreement. She shifted in her seat, leaning forward slightly. "I mean, don't you want to talk about it?" she asked. "We are talking about it," I said calmly. "But you're not asking why. If you wanted to explain, you would have started with that." That made her blink. Ashley had always been good at conversations where she controlled the direction, where she introduced the topic, framed the emotions, and guided the other person toward the reaction she wanted. But this time there was no direction, no argument, no resistance, just acceptance. And that seemed to bother her more than a fight would have. She leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. "It's just, I feel like we've been drifting," she said carefully. I nodded once. "Okay. And things have been kind of routine lately. All right. And I think maybe we'd be better as friends." Another small nod. "Fair enough." Now she looked genuinely unsettled. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was the uncomfortable realization that the emotional leverage she expected to have simply wasn't there. "Ryan," she said slowly, "you're being really calm about this." "I don't see a reason not to be." That answer landed heavier than I expected. Because in that exact moment, while she was studying my face trying to figure out what I was thinking, one very clear thought formed in my mind. Not angry, not dramatic, just clear. She said we should just be friends. So I will treat her exactly like one. And friends don't negotiate breakups. Friends don't try to convince each other to stay in relationships. Friends don't invest emotional energy into fixing something the other person already decided to end. Friends simply accept reality and move on. Once that idea settled in my mind, everything else suddenly felt very simple. Ashley was still talking. "And I just think we both deserve the freedom to explore things without pressure." I nodded again. "That makes sense." Another pause. "You're not upset?" she asked. "Should I be? I mean, we've been together almost 2 years." "Yeah," I said. She waited for more. There wasn't any. For a moment, we just sat there listening to the quiet noise of the cafe. Someone at another table laughed softly. A barista called out an order. Rain tapped against the glass. Ashley looked down at her drink again, clearly recalculating the entire interaction. Because the emotional script she expected was gone. And the strangest part was, I wasn't pretending to be calm. I actually was. Once you accept a situation completely, the urge to argue disappears. So I finished the last sip of my coffee, set the cup down on the table, and stood up. Ashley looked up immediately. "You're leaving?" "Yeah. Already. You said we should just be friends," I replied. putting on my jacket. Friends don't usually sit around analyzing breakups. That wasn't sarcasm. It was just a statement. She opened her mouth like she wanted to say something else, but nothing came out. For the first time since the conversation started, she looked uncertain. Not about the decision, about the outcome. I reached for my wallet, left cash on the table for my coffee, and nodded politely. Well, take care, Ashley. And then I walked out of the cafe. The Denver air outside was cool and smelled like wet pavement. Cars moved slowly down the street with their headlights glowing in the gray afternoon light. I stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle. No anger, no sadness, just clarity. Because the moment someone says they want to just be friends, the relationship is already over. All that's left is deciding how much dignity you keep on the way out. And as I started walking home, another thought crossed my mind. Ashley expected me to stay in her life, just in a smaller role. But she didn't realize something yet. When I said, "Sounds good," I didn't mean we would downgrade the relationship. I meant something much simpler. I meant I was walking out of her life completely, and I had no intention of coming back. The walk home from the cafe took about 20 minutes. Normally, I would have called Ashley while walking. That had become our routine over the last year. If we weren't together, we were usually on the phone, filling silence with small updates about our day. That time, my phone stayed in my pocket. The streets of Denver were damp from the light rain, and the evening traffic had just started building. Headlights reflected off the wet pavement, stretching into long white streaks across the asphalt. I walked slowly, hands in my jacket pockets, replaying the conversation in my head. Not the breakup itself. That part had actually been the easiest moment of the entire relationship. What I kept thinking about were the months leading up to it. Because the more I thought about them, the more something uncomfortable became obvious. For a long time, I had been carrying most of the relationship without really noticing it. Ashley and I had met almost 2 years earlier at a mutual friend's birthday party. She was funny, confident, and had the kind of personality that made people immediately gravitate toward her. Back then, the dynamic felt balanced. We both made an effort. We both showed up. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. At first, it was small things. Ashley worked at an advertising agency downtown, and she hated her job. Every evening she had a new story about a difficult client, a demanding manager, or a coworker who had apparently made her day worse. Most nights I listened for an hour or more while she vented. At the time, I didn't mind. That's what partners do. They support each other. But looking back while walking down that wet Denver sidewalk, I realized something strange. Ashley talked about her problems constantly, but she almost never asked about mine. Whenever I had a difficult day at work, the conversation somehow shifted back to her within minutes. Not intentionally, just naturally, like the relationship had quietly reorganized itself around her experiences. Then there was the apartment move. 6 months earlier, Ashley decided she wanted to move out of her old place. The building had thin walls, the parking situation was terrible, and she said the entire environment stressed her out. So one Saturday morning, I showed up with my truck and spent 8 hours helping her move. Boxes, furniture, trips up and down narrow apartment stairs. By the end of the day, my back was sore and my hands were covered in small scratches from carrying awkward furniture. Ashley thanked me with a quick hug and a distracted, "I owe you one." That was the last time we ever mentioned it. A few weeks later, her car started making a strange grinding noise whenever she braked. Ashley panicked. She was convinced the repair would cost thousands of dollars and that the mechanic would probably try to scam her. So I spent an entire Saturday afternoon researching the issue, calling a mechanic I trusted, and driving her car across town to get it inspected. It turned out to be a relatively simple brake replacement. While the mechanic worked, Ashley sat next to me in the waiting area scrolling through Instagram. "I'm so glad you're good with this stuff," she said casually. Then she went back to her phone. At the time, I didn't think much about it. But as I walked home that evening after the cafe conversation, a pattern was slowly becoming impossible to ignore. Ashley needed help constantly. Emotional support, logistical help, practical help, and I had always been there. Not because she forced me, because I cared. But when I tried to remember the last time Ashley had done something similar for me, my mind came up strangely empty. Even small things. If I had a long workday, she usually responded with something like, "That S asterisk CKs." Then 5 minutes later, the conversation would return to her coworker drama. Another memory surfaced. A month earlier, I had been sick for almost an entire week with a brutal flu. Fever, headache, barely enough energy to get out of bed. Ashley had stopped by my apartment once during those 5 days. She stayed for about 30 minutes, dropped off a bag of takeout soup, and spent most of the visit complaining about a client presentation she had to prepare. Before leaving, she kissed my forehead and said, "Text me when you feel better." I hadn't really questioned any of it at the time, because when you're inside a relationship, you don't analyze every detail. You just keep moving forward. But now that the relationship had ended so abruptly in that cafe, the entire picture looked different. Like someone had suddenly turned on a bright light in a dim room. By the time I reached my apartment building, the rain had stopped. The air smelled fresh, and the clouds were slowly starting to break apart. I climbed the stairs to my place, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The apartment was quiet. Too quiet. For the first time in a long time, there were no messages waiting from Ashley. No long texts about her workday. No complaints about coworkers. No random questions about dinner plans. Just silence. I tossed my keys onto the kitchen counter and sat down on the couch. For a moment I just sat there, letting the quiet settle. Then my phone buzzed. Ashley. I looked at the screen. Her message was short. "Are we really doing this?" I stared at the text for a few seconds. Not angry, not emotional, just thinking. Because the strange part was, from my perspective, there was nothing left to do. She had already made the decision. All I had done was accept it. I typed a simple reply. "Yeah, I think it's for the best." The 3 typing dots appeared almost instantly, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, another message came through. "I didn't expect you to just walk away like that." I looked at the words for a moment, and for the first time since leaving the cafe, a small realization settled in. Ashley had suggested we stay friends, but she never expected me to actually leave. What she expected was something else entirely. She expected the same dynamic we had always had. She would set the emotional terms, and I would adjust myself around them. But something had quietly shifted the moment I said, "Sounds good." Because once you stop trying to hold a relationship together by yourself, you realize how much weight you were actually carrying. And that realization was about to change everything. Ashley's message stayed on my screen longer than it probably should have. "I didn't expect you to just walk away like that." That sentence said more than she probably realized. Not "I'm sorry," not "can we talk," just surprise. I placed my phone on the coffee table and leaned back on the couch, staring at the ceiling for a moment. For the first time in almost 2 years, the evening was completely mine. No scheduled phone call. No long conversation about her coworkers. No spontaneous request to come over and talk about something. Just quiet. And the quiet made something else clear. Ashley hadn't ended the relationship expecting a clean break. She expected a softer version of it. The kind where we still texted every day. Where I still helped her when she needed something. Where the emotional support stayed exactly the same, just without the commitment. The more I thought about it, the more obvious that became. Because Ashley had always been very good at maintaining emotional connections with people even after the official relationship changed. One of her exes still occasionally liked her Instagram posts. Another one sometimes commented on her stories. She always described them the same way. "We're just friends now." At the time I had believed that. Now I realized what it actually meant. Those guys never fully left. They just got moved into a different role. And Ashley probably assumed I would quietly accept the same downgrade. The phone buzzed again. Another message from her. "So what does this mean exactly?" I picked up the phone again. For a moment I considered ignoring it. But I decided clarity was better. I typed a response. "It means we're not together anymore." The typing dots appeared immediately. Then another message. I know that, Ryan. A few seconds later, another one followed. I meant, are we still talking? There it was. Exactly what I suspected. Ashley wasn't asking if we had broken up. She was asking if she still had access to me. I thought about that for a moment before replying, because technically she had been the one to end things. But the situation she imagined clearly looked very different from the one that was actually happening. Her version probably looked something like this. We stop calling each other boyfriend and girlfriend, but we still meet for coffee sometimes. We still text during the day. I still show up when she needs help moving something heavy or dealing with a stressful situation, just without the label, without the responsibility, without the expectation of exclusivity. And for a moment, I realized how easy it would be to slip into that role, because it wouldn't require a big dramatic decision, just small adjustments, answering a message here, meeting for a drink there, helping with a problem because we're still friends. But once that dynamic starts, it never really stops. You slowly become the emotional safety net for someone who no longer considers you a partner. And that thought made my decision simple. I typed my response slowly. I think it's better if we don't. The typing dots appeared again. This time they stayed longer. Finally her reply came through. So you're just cutting me off? The phrasing almost made me smile. Cutting her off. Like I was taking something away from her. But she had already taken the relationship off the table. All I was doing was refusing the smaller role she assumed I would accept. I responded, you said we should just be friends. Yes. And that's not something I want. 3 dots. Pause. Then another message. That's kind of extreme. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on my knees as I read the screen. Extreme. The word felt strange in that context. Ending a relationship had been reasonable, but walking away completely was extreme. That difference said a lot. I typed again. I don't think it is. Another pause. Then Ashley sent a longer message. I just thought we could still have each other in our lives. We get along well. I don't see why it has to be all or nothing. I read the message twice. On the surface, it sounded reasonable, friendly, mature even. But underneath it was something else entirely. Because keeping someone in your life after ending a relationship only works when both people want the same thing. And in most cases they don't. One person is moving on. The other one is quietly hoping something changes. I didn't want to be that second person. So I replied honestly. Because I'm not interested in pretending the relationship never happened. A full minute passed. Then 2. Finally Ashley responded. I think you're overreacting. That message didn't surprise me. It was the natural conclusion when someone doesn't get the reaction they expected. From her perspective, this probably looked dramatic. From mine, it felt very simple. You either move forward together, or you move forward separately. But staying halfway connected usually just drags the situation out longer. I placed the phone back on the table again. A few seconds later it buzzed once more. Another message. Then another. Ashley was typing faster now. Ryan, this is ridiculous. We don't have to be strangers. You're acting like I betrayed you or something. I didn't open those messages right away. Instead I stood up and walked into the kitchen to pour myself a glass of water. Because the truth was, Ashley wasn't wrong about one thing. She hadn't betrayed me. She had simply decided the relationship wasn't what she wanted anymore. And that was her right. But what she didn't seem to understand yet was that the same freedom applied to me. She could choose to end the relationship. And I could choose to leave entirely. Not out of anger. Not out of revenge. Just out of self-respect. When I came back into the living room, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Ashley. This one was shorter. Are you really serious about this? I stared at the screen for a moment, then typed one final reply. Yeah. The typing dots appeared again, then disappeared, then appeared one last time. Her final message came through a few seconds later. Okay. Just that one word. And for the first time since leaving the cafe earlier that evening, the conversation finally stopped. No more typing dots. No more buzzing notifications. Just silence again. I placed the phone face down on the table. And as the quiet settled back into the apartment, one thing became very clear. Ashley had expected the relationship to change shape. What she hadn't expected was for it to disappear entirely. The next morning felt strange. Not dramatic, not painful, just quiet. I woke up a little before 7, the way I usually did on weekdays, but for the first time in a long while there was no message waiting on my phone. Ashley normally texted early. Sometimes it was a quick good morning. Other times it was already a complaint about traffic, her boss, or a coworker who had apparently done something irritating before the workday even started. That morning the notification screen was empty. For a moment I simply stared at it while sitting on the edge of my bed. Then I set the phone down and got up. The morning routine felt oddly peaceful. Coffee, shower, a quiet apartment with nothing but the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of cars outside. Normally, by the time I left for work, Ashley and I would have exchanged at least a dozen messages. Small things, memes, quick complaints about the day ahead. But that morning there was nothing, and the silence didn't feel bad. Felt clean. By the time I got to the office downtown, I had almost forgotten about the conversation entirely. Work helped with that. I worked as a project coordinator for a construction company, which meant most days were packed with meetings, emails, scheduling issues, and contractors calling with last-minute problems. There wasn't much room in the schedule to sit around analyzing relationships. Still, around lunchtime, curiosity got the better of me. I checked my phone. 3 messages from Ashley, all sent earlier in the morning. The first one was from around 8:30. Hey! The second came about 20 minutes later. So we're really not talking anymore? The third message arrived shortly after that. I still think this is kind of unfair. I read them once and then locked my phone again. Not because I was trying to ignore her, because there wasn't really anything left to say. Ashley had already explained what she wanted. She wanted to stay connected. I had already explained what I wanted. Clean break. Continuing the conversation would just reopen the same discussion again. And strangely enough, that realization made something very clear. For the first time since we met, I wasn't adjusting my decisions around Ashley's expectations. For almost 2 years, a lot of my choices had quietly revolved around her. When to meet, when to call, when to help with something. Even when to go out with friends sometimes depended on whether Ashley had something going on. It wasn't something I had consciously noticed while it was happening. But now that the connection was gone, the difference was obvious. Around 2 in the afternoon, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Ashley. This one was longer. I know you're probably busy, but I just want to say I don't understand why you're being so cold about this. I wasn't trying to hurt you. I just thought we could handle this like adults. I leaned back in my chair and read the message again. Cold. That word stood out. Because from my perspective, nothing about the situation felt cold. Felt honest. Ashley had made a decision about the relationship. And I had made one about what came after. But from her point of view, the absence of emotional negotiation probably looked very different. Most breakups involve long conversations, arguments, attempts to renegotiate the terms. Maybe even a few weeks of confusing mixed signals before things finally end. What she got instead was something much simpler. Acceptance. And apparently that was harder for her to process. I didn't respond to that message either. Not out of spite. Just because repeating the same explanation again wouldn't change anything. The rest of the afternoon passed quickly. By the time I left the office, the sky outside had cleared completely. Denver evenings in early fall had that perfect cool air that made walking home feel better than driving. Halfway through the walk, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Ashley. This one was shorter. So that's it then? I stopped at a crosswalk and looked down at the screen. For a moment I considered answering. Not to restart the discussion, just to close it properly. So when the light changed and I crossed the street, I typed a short reply. Yeah, I think that's best. Her response came almost immediately. I didn't think you'd be this stubborn. I couldn't help smiling slightly when I read that. Stubborn. That word usually appears when someone refuses to change a decision you hoped they would reconsider. But in this situation, the only thing I was refusing to do was stay in a dynamic that didn't make sense anymore. I typed one last response. It's not stubborn, it's just moving on. This time the typing dots appeared quickly, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally her reply came through. I guess I just thought you cared more than that. I read the message slowly, because on the surface it sounded like an accusation, but underneath it revealed something else. Ashley believed caring meant staying emotionally available even after the relationship ended. From her perspective, the fact that I wasn't trying to maintain that connection meant I must not have cared enough. But the truth was almost the opposite. Sometimes the cleanest way to respect what a relationship was is to let it end completely, not stretch it into something weaker. I typed a final message. I did care. That's why I'm not pretending we can go backwards. This time the typing dots didn't appear. A full minute passed. Then another. Finally one last message arrived. Okay. Just like the night before. Short, neutral, and final. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and continued walking home. The sun was starting to set behind the buildings, casting long orange reflections across the glass windows downtown. And as the evening air cooled around me, one realization settled in quietly. Ashley had expected the breakup to be complicated, messy, full of conversations and emotional negotiations. Instead, it had been simple. She changed the terms of the relationship, and I decided not to participate in the new version. At the time, that probably looked cold to her. But what she didn't realize yet was that the real changes were only just beginning. The first real test came 4 days later. Not through a long emotional message, not through a dramatic phone call, through something much simpler, a request. It was Thursday evening, and I had just gotten home from work. I was halfway through cooking dinner when my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Ashley. For a moment I just stared at the screen. We hadn't spoken since the short, okay exchange 2 nights earlier. Part of me wondered if this message would finally be the apology conversation people usually expect after a breakup. Maybe she had thought things through. Maybe she wanted to talk properly. I wiped my hands on a towel and opened the message. Hey, random question. That already told me everything I needed to know. Because apology conversations don't start with random question. I kept reading. Did you still have that toolkit I lent you a few months ago? I think I left it at your place when we fixed my kitchen shelf. I leaned back slightly against the counter and thought about it. Technically, she was right. About 5 months earlier, one of the shelves in Ashley's apartment had started pulling out of the drywall. She called me late one evening, frustrated because it was holding several heavy kitchen items. So I drove over with my drill, wall anchors, and a full toolkit. The repair took about 20 minutes. After that, we ordered takeout and watched a movie. And apparently, somewhere in the process, the small red toolbox she owned had ended up at my place. I opened the closet near the hallway and checked. Sure enough, the box was sitting on the top shelf. I picked up my phone again. Yeah, I still have it. Her response came almost instantly. Oh, good. Then another message followed. Could I swing by tomorrow after work and grab it? I read the message twice, and suddenly the situation felt very familiar, because this was exactly how Ashley used to operate when she wanted something. Start with a small, practical request. Keep the tone casual. Make it seem harmless. The request itself wasn't unreasonable. It was her toolbox. But something about the situation still felt off. Because if the goal was simply retrieving an item, there were several easy ways to do that. She could ask me to leave it outside the building. She could send a friend to pick it up. She could even ask me to drop it off somewhere. Instead, she wanted to come by personally, which meant stepping back into the same space we had spent so much time in together. The same apartment, the same couch, the same kitchen where I was currently standing. I wasn't naive enough to think that was a coincidence. So I responded carefully. Sure, I can leave it with the front desk downstairs. The typing dots appeared immediately, then stopped, then appeared again. Finally her reply came through. You don't have to do that. A second message followed right behind it. I can just come up for 5 minutes. There it was. 5 minutes. That phrase always sounds harmless. But in reality, 5 minutes almost never stays 5 minutes. 5 minutes becomes a quick conversation. A quick conversation becomes sitting down for a moment. And suddenly an hour has passed and the emotional boundaries you set quietly dissolve. Ashley knew that, whether consciously or not. I leaned against the counter and typed my response. I think the front desk is easier. The typing dots appeared again. They stayed longer this time. Her next message arrived about 20 seconds later. Ryan, seriously? It's just a toolbox. Technically, she was right. It was just a toolbox. But the location of the exchange mattered more than the object. Because going back to the apartment would reset the emotional environment. And Ashley clearly expected that. I replied, yeah, and it'll be waiting downstairs. Another pause. Then a slightly longer message appeared. You're making this weird. I couldn't help smiling slightly at that. Because the only thing that had changed in this situation was that I wasn't following the old script anymore. Before the breakup, if Ashley asked to stop by, I would have said yes without thinking twice. I would have cleaned the apartment a little. Maybe asked if she wanted to stay for dinner. That was the normal dynamic. Now the dynamic was different. And apparently that difference felt uncomfortable to her. I typed one more message. It's not weird. It's just simple. For a moment there was no response. Then finally her reply came through. Fine. Just like the last two conversations. Short, neutral, but not entirely satisfied. The next evening after work, I stopped by the building's front desk and handed the toolbox to the receptionist. Someone named Ashley might come by to pick this up, I said. She nodded and placed it behind the counter. No problem. Then I went upstairs to my apartment. About an hour later my phone buzzed again. Ashley. I got it. I read the message while sitting on the couch. A few seconds passed. Then another message arrived. You really weren't kidding about the whole distance thing. I stared at the screen for a moment before replying. No. 3 dots appeared. Then disappeared. Then appeared again. Finally her message came through. I guess I just didn't think you'd actually stick to it. That sentence told me something important. Ashley had expected the boundaries to soften over time. Maybe not immediately, but gradually. A message here. A casual conversation there. Eventually things would drift into that comfortable in-between space where we were technically broken up but still emotionally connected. But that wasn't going to happen. And I think she was finally starting to understand that. I typed one last response. It's better this way. This time there were no typing dots. No follow-up question. Just silence. I set the phone down on the table again. And as the quiet settled back into the apartment, I realized something. Ashley hadn't just lost the relationship. She had lost the access she always assumed would still be there. And for the first time since the cafe conversation, that reality was starting to become clear to her. A few days passed after the toolbox incident, and the silence between Ashley and me became something real. Not tense. Just empty. For the first time in almost 2 years, our lives were actually separate. No random updates about her coworkers. No late-night complaints about clients. No sudden requests for help with something around her apartment. One evening after work, I met a couple of friends for drinks downtown. Normally, Ashley would text halfway through the night asking where I was, who I was with, or if I wanted to stop by her place afterward. That night my phone stayed quiet, and something strange happened. I realized I wasn't checking it. Not out of discipline. Just because I didn't expect anything to be there anymore. Around 11 p.m. When I got home, there was finally a notification. Ashley. Hey. Random question. I stared at the screen for a moment before opening it. Do you still have that contact for the mechanic who fixed my brakes? I almost laughed. Because even after everything, the dynamic she expected was still the same. But this time, I didn't step back into it. I replied with one simple message. Yeah, I'll text you the number. And that was all. No conversation. No follow-up questions. Just information. exactly the way you would help a casual acquaintance. Ashley's response came a minute later. Thanks. Normally that would have turned into another conversation. She might have asked how work was going or mentioned something stressful about her day. But this time, the conversation ended right there. And that's when the real shift started to happen. Over the next couple of weeks, Ashley sent a few more small messages like that. Questions about contacts. A quick recommendation for a restaurant. Once even asking if I still had a jacket she thought she left behind. Each time I responded politely, short, neutral, friendly, but distant. And slowly, something became obvious. Ashley wasn't angry. She was confused. Because the version of me she expected after the breakup was still emotionally available. The version she got instead was someone calm, polite, and completely independent from her life. And that difference changed the dynamic more than any argument ever could. Because once someone realizes they no longer have access to you the way they used to, they start seeing the past very differently.